performance. Thank you so much. Thanks. And thank you for joining us tonight. Many ask me, why are you organizing this event? Maybe close your eyes for a moment and listen to what I am about to describe to you. It was about 6 a.m. in the morning when 6 people knocked on the door, and my sleepy mom opened the door. Immediately after, we have 4 suitcases on the dining room full of firearms, pepper spray, handcuffs. We both were so scared. We were not sure what's going on. My disabled dad is lay on the ground. His eyes were closed, but his eyes were screaming out not to touch my daughter and my wife. Immediately, in few minutes, they started to search our house. In an hour, our house looked like it was earthquake. I escaped. I was forced to escape. Before I escaped, the only thing that I could remember was the sentence I heard from one of those people that all of the other friends were actually arrested. I didn't think that this was really fair, to have such fate that I could get out and my friends are arrested. Today, many are killed, executed, and the rest are in the lines of fire. The reason I'm standing here and you are here is to have strong, uniting voices to help our people for freedom. For an Iran that I dream. A dream that looks like Iranian people not begging for their basic rights, not get beaten because they are smart and intelligent, not get killed because they think differently. I thank you joining here to hear from all of us. Now I want to welcome Dr. Tahirih to join us on the stage and welcome you.
Hello, everybody. My name is Tamer Mustafa. I'm the director of the Center for Comparative Muslim Studies at Simon Fraser University, and I want to welcome everybody this evening. The center is very pleased to provide space for tonight's event. We're always keen to work with our community partners when our purposes align, and this is certainly an occasion where there is alignment. So the mission statement for the Center for Comparative Muslim Studies reads that it is our purpose, quote, to foster academic and public discussion and understanding of Muslim societies and cultures. The center shifts the analysis from the notion of a single religious landscape defined by the religion of Islam to that of individuals of different experiences and different interpretations as agents in constructing their societies and cultures. And so what we're witnessing in Iran today, I think, is precisely this. Individuals who are pushing back against a state monopoly on religious interpretation and who are working to redefine their nation and state based on the plurality of experiences and ways of being. And so I want to thank the Woman Life Freedom Coalition for all of their hard work in organizing this event and bringing it to SFU. And I look forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Arig El-Sheba. I'm the Associate Vice President, Equity and Inclusion at the University of British Columbia. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me to make some opening remarks and to introduce the panelists today. It's such an honor to be here. So first, let me start by acknowledging and honoring the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations on whose unceded and ancestral territories we are gathering this evening. This evening, we will hear from distinguished guests who will speak on the subject of human rights in the context of the events taking place in Iran. However, the principles compelling us to gather here this evening transcend nations, I believe, globally and locally. These are principles advocated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, for example. That is to say that every human on this planet should be entitled to dignity, equality, and freedom. And furthermore, that the notions of choice and self-determinations are core to human rights principles. I question the cultural relativism argument that says universal human rights are irrelevant because they do not account for cultural differences. I believe that while the international human rights system is imperfect, the cultural relativism argument can easily be misused to dismiss the notion that fundamental rights and freedoms must extend to women, ethnically minoritized groups, and members marginalized by gender identity and sexual orientation, no matter their cultural backgrounds and faith. As a racialized Muslim and queer woman myself, and a member of the Yemeni diaspora in Canada, I know very well the level of psychic and physical harm, as well as the looming threat of lethal violence that accompanies extreme misogynistic and homophobic attitudes and beliefs. I'm keenly aware of the ways that Islamic doctrines are, in my view, distorted in ways that facilitate state-sanctioned gender inequity and gender-based violence. I feel a sense of humility and gratitude towards the peoples of Iran, and particularly women, who are relentlessly protesting against the regime there in the face of violence. These efforts inspire and empower those in the country and others in the region, and globally, in fact. Having worked in academia for the past 20 years, I'm attuned to the importance of teaching, research, and service in the areas of human rights and the mission of higher education to influence social betterment and social justice locally, nationally, and globally. Universities Canada, the collective voice of Canadian universities, has released a statement condemning Iranian regime's violence on university campuses as a profound challenge to the free exchange of ideas, which is an essential component of human rights. So with that, I'll introduce the distinguished panelists and tonight's moderator who will engage us in that free exchange of ideas. Nazanin Afshin-jam MacKay. Nazanin is an international human rights and democracy activist author, public speaker, and president and co-founder of Stop Children Executions organization. She holds a BA in International Relations and Political Science from UBC, holds top honors in her master's degree in diplomacy with a concentration in international conflict management at Norwich University in Vermont. And in 2016, the University of Western Ontario conferred an honorary degree of laws. Homa is an award-winning novelist, a seasoned journalist, and a human rights activist. Her bylines have appeared in publications such as the Globe and Mail, Literary Hub, Toronto Star, Literary Review of Canada, and more. She has spoken about human rights across North America and Europe, including at the United Nations, Geneva. Her debut novel, Daughters of Smoke and Fire, the story of a Kurdish woman's search for justice and freedom, won the 2020 Nautilus Book Award. Elle Toussi. Elle is an Iranian-American cross-platform journalist. She currently serves as the co-chair of the Society of Professional Journalists International Community that works diligently to address the safety of journalists, advocating for press freedom globally, and providing training for journalists within their network. Her investigative work can be seen at New York Times, BBC, and various media outlets. Soushiant, Zanganehpour, and I'm not sure if he's with us. Is it? Oh, there he is. Okay, you made it on time. Over the past 15 years, Soushiant has been involved in organizing several human and civic rights advocacy initiatives that gained national and international recognition and the support of the highest elected officials in Canada. He has worked with Article 19, Freedom House, United for Iran, as well as global human rights leaders, including Dr. Ahmed Shahid, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Islamic Republic of Iran, Dr. Shireen Abadi, and others, writing reports highlighting the roles of foreign companies in aiding internet censorship in Iran and delivering capacity, building workshops to citizen journalists to safely get critical information out of Iran. And finally, we're pleased to have Negar Mojtahedi join us as the moderator of tonight's panel. Negar is an award-winning documentary filmmaker and journalist at Global News. Her first documentary, My Dream Goes All the Way to Iran, is a powerful portrait of the Iranian expatriate and immigrant population that is often misunderstood and misrepresented. So with that, I turn things over to Negar and Zendegi Azadi.
Introduction, and thank you so much to all of you for being here, and to those of us who are joining us via the live stream right now as well, and thank you to our panelists for making the journey here for tonight. Let's begin this important conversation by discussing how we got to where we are right now, and for people who aren't too familiar with Iran, if you could explain how where we are today has really been 43 years in the making. If we could start with you, Soushiant, and then we'll make our way to you, Nazanin, there.
Thanks very much. Can you repeat the question?
How about you want me to? Because he doesn't.
Maybe go with Nazanin.
Okay, we'll go with Nazanin first, or make our way to Soushiant.
Well, first of all, thank you to the Women Life Coalition and to UBC and SFU. We're all very pleased to be here. So, as you said, Negar, this is 43 years in the making. This is 43 years of embers burning. So while the death of Mahsa Amini, Gina, sparked these embers, it's really 43 years of repression spilling out on the streets. It's ethnic and religious minorities that have been persecuted for 43 years. It's journalists who have been silenced, their freedom of expression curtailed. Anytime you say anything against the regime, you're imprisoned, detained, or even face the death penalty. It's lawyers defending human rights activists or those that have taken off their hijab, or they are the ones ending up in jails too. It's animal rights activists coming out on the streets, their pet dogs shot in front of their very own eyes. It's environmentalists screaming out for the environmental degradation that's taking place, and a corrupt, mismanaged government that doesn't take notice or doesn't care about these things. So really it's a cross-section of people, of ages, diverse people from all over Iran that have finally risen up and have said that reform is not the way to go, and that they want a full change of regime.
Yeah, that was very well articulated. To shed light a little bit on what Nazanin mentioned, I love that our speaker used the word minoritized groups. And so I'm going to build on that and talk about what has happened to ethnic minorities in Iran. The worst thing you can do to a group of humans is to present them as threats. Once people are afraid of that group, they're not willing to open up to them. They don't want to learn about them. And that's been a very effective strategy of the Iranian government to come in power and tell the dominant group that all the ethnic groups, and you need to remember that about 50% of Iran is Persian, and the other 50% are non-Persian ethnic groups. That this entire 50% of population are against you, and they're going to tear your country apart, and they're threats to your territorial integrity. And with that, they started all the acts of violence against the ethnic minorities that were basically empowered by the apathy that came from the public. So ethnic minorities, speaking mostly for the Kurds because that's where most of my research and writing has been on. Kurds very clear in the beginning that all they want is within a democratic Iran, some autonomy over who they are and some connection to their cultural identity. They wanted to have a share in the resources, in the natural resources that are part of these minoritized groups but are stolen, and people who live there and have been in that land for centuries are denied any share of those natural resources. So what we have witnessed over there has been what academics call ethnocide, which is killing ethnic minorities, not as an act of only officially and physically erasing them, but by disconnecting them from their own identity, by denying them the right to read and write in their mother tongue, and therefore creating a cognitive dissonance between generations who can't communicate with each other. Because if you can't read and write in your mother tongue, who are you? If you're denied that right, who are you? And that's just the beginning of things. They have been deliberately left to flounder in terms of infrastructure, medical buildings, educational facilities, everything, cultural center, everything has been completely denied in this group. And so their pain has been used against them. Imagine the people that are denied access to everything that empowers and educates you, and then mock them for their lack of access to all of those things. And this is just really the tip of the iceberg. I want to give time to my fellow panelists to add on this. But in terms of the economy, the poverty, the misrepresentation, the denial of their identity, the defining of their identity, in so many ways, we see the Kurds are now at the heart and the forefront of the resistance because they saw the most brutal face of the government, something that took until the year 2009 for the rest of Iran to see. They saw it in 1997, and they were the ones who knew why reform is impossible, why this is a government that's completely incapable of reform.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
It's very tough to follow Nazanin and Ava because today I've learned so much from them. But I can give you my perspective because I know in the beginning you mentioned, how do we get here? And as a journalist and as someone who is going into filmmaking, I always think about the story. And when it comes to Iran, it's over 40 years, and we still have questions, right? And a majority of the time, people are asking those questions, what happened? And it's not a curriculum that's, unless you choose to actually study this in school, or you are Iranian, you really don't know this story, or you haven't lived it. And 40 years ago, more than 40 years ago, an entire country changed. And we're now in a situation where if you're Iranian, you have the opportunity to have agency to tell these stories. And stories are the most powerful thing that you can share so that people can understand, have empathy, and connect. And so when the country changed, you repressed an entire community, an entire group of people. And now it's coming to the surface. And what's happening now is you're going to be seeing a community that has gone through trauma finally being able to have agency to tell you those stories and to tell you their experience. And it's going to be happening not just in the next few weeks, but for years to come. And where we started 40 plus years ago, those stories still need to be told. And where we are now, they're still going to continue to tell these stories. And that's where I think, from my point of view, I think where my intersection comes in when it comes to Iran is finally having the agency as an Iranian American to be able to tell those stories from that perspective.
Thanks very much. I think the perspective I have is a little bit different because of the background I bring. I work in the field of technology and working on the future of governance, the future of decision-making, and their applications to our democracies. So for me, the perspective I have is less about oppression and more about a people that have outgrown a set of rules that were imposed on them, incrementally and irreversibly. Every generation had their moment, had their battle. I think back to 96, 97 when we first found out about the first raid on, I believe it was Sharif or Amir Kabir University, where Ahmad Batevi was holding up that shirt of his bloody friend. Yeah. Each generation has had their moment, and we're in a moment where we've outgrown the clothes imposed on us. I feel like this is the most important moment because it's a moment to delegitimize what has been there, as well as legitimize what could be there instead. I think it's irreversible, whether it's a few months from now, a year from now, or a little bit later. There's no going back.
Speaking of that moment, and this question is for all the panelists or anyone who would like to answer it, when you found out about Mahsa Jina Amini, did you know that this would turn into what has become Iran's George Floyd moment?
Looking to me.
Soushiant or Elle, would you like to start? And one of you?
Sure, I'd love to talk about this. So, from my perspective, when I first learned about it, my mind immediately went into something's happening here. And I'm almost certain I need to figure out through my organization how we can provide resources for those that are going to be covering this to be safe and do it in a way that they're not going to risk their safety. I had no idea to what capacity it was going to be. But from my perspective, there are many points in our history. Let's bring the viewpoint out a little bit. Over the past few years, I personally covered the Syrian crisis, right? I went to the refugee camps, and I remember when I covered that, there were lots of instances and lots of stories that came out of that, but there was one photo of a young boy on the shore, on the beach, that died. That became the moment that the world paid attention, right? In the US, we had George Floyd. That was the moment for the US to finally come to terms with, there's a problem here. And this one particular instance, this one particular story is what we need to pay attention to. What happened to Mahsa was not something that is uncommon in Iran. But with everything that is going on, this was that moment. And I think it's important to think of that in perspective of everything that's going on in the world, because as someone that in my field of work, I think about those things. And I also think about, okay, what's going to happen next? But I mean, I don't want to take up too much time because I know the panelists will have more to add to it, but I think it's really important to think about these sorts of things in a global perspective too.
I think for me, the most important thing about, well, two things. First of all, that her brutal killing struck a nerve with everyone because millions of Iranians have been harassed, humiliated on the street, and some of us have seen actual violence over a few strands of hair, because the money that should go to providing the welfare for citizens instead goes to guidance patrol, that's been loosely translated as morality police in Western media. And so when she got killed over a few strands of hair, so many of us thought that could have been me, that can be my sister, that can be my cousin. So it was something that was really close to all of our experiences. The other thing about Gina is there are three groups of people on the street today, and she embodied all three. The youth, she was only 22. The Kurds, she was Kurdish, and she was a woman. And these are the three people who have been at the forefront of that. And she embodied intersectionality. And intersectionality is what have made this year's uprising so much more powerful. Intersectionality is everything. It's the difference between defeat and victory. It's our ability to finally bring it to the center, the groups that we have distrusted and marginalized for so long. And I really honor Gina for that exit strategy, for the way, because Gina shares the same root etymologically as the word jin, woman, and jian, life. Gina is a giver of life. And to me, that young woman gave life even in death.
That's so beautiful. Would anyone else like to answer, or should we move on to the next?
I had a very different experience learning about Maz Jobrani. It wasn't a George Floyd moment for me particularly, just because I've been in this field for almost 20 years, and I've seen so much of the brutality of this regime. I've seen so many political prisoners of conscience in the jails. I've talked to the families of children on death row crying to me and sharing with me details of how their kids were tortured in jails, put into solitary confinement, sleeping on cold cement floors with cockroaches crawling on. I mean, there's just so many examples that, for me, it wasn't a surprise that Mahsa Amini was beaten on the head and then succumbed to her death from this brutal regime that has continuously done this and has executed tens of thousands of people. But I know, Negar, you had that moment. As a journalist, you recognized that that was a George Floyd moment. Maybe you'd like to share your perspective.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, as soon as I heard about what happened to her, I went to my managing editor and I said, "This is it. Something big is going to happen. We need to be on this right away." And there was just this feeling inside of me, as you said, as a journalist, and I just knew people were fed up. And like as Homa was saying, when I heard about that, I thought about every other Iranian woman who has been through that. And to learn that somebody could die from it, I said, that's it. People are going to rise up. They've had enough now. And that was definitely my experience.
Yeah, look, I was a bit shocked, to be honest, of how quickly it spread. But when you look back at the reasons and you look at the layering of what's been happening over the past few years with this sort of global consciousness movement that is happening, and the Me Too and several other global movements to recognize the equality and equity of women in all aspects of society. And I think a particular focus on the structural limitations that have been placed on women, even in Western society, I think enabled a lot of emphasis on this as a problem, almost legitimizing and humanizing the experience, the indignity I think that many women have gone through in our culture. Had those things not happened, I don't think that we would have got as much Western media attention, and therefore not as much inertia. Because as Nazanin says, like we're not all like, this is not news to anybody, right? In fact, when I saw it, I was like, not again.
Yeah.
You know, like, here we go again. And here we go again because you feel a sense of futility. You feel a sense of like, what can we do from here, right? That's what the initial feeling that came over me. But I got so optimistic when so many other people were jumping on this as a moment, as a George Floyd moment for us, right?
If I could just add just a second to that. It was really interesting to see how, again, Mahsa Amini was the spark, but soon after, there was an uprising against compulsory hijab. Then it grew larger to a women's movement. And of course, then it being defined as a women-led revolution, and then expanding out to what we've just been discussing, 43 years of repression. It's interesting how it grew, and it layered upon layer of more and more activists and advocates coming together.
Yeah, no, definitely. And Elle, you're working on a documentary about the Iranian National Ballet. Can you briefly talk about that and tell us how that shows us how much Iran has changed since the 1979 revolution, and how something as simple as dancing is illegal?
Sure. So I'm hoping that most people here are aware of the song that's very popular right now, Baraya, right? If you listen to the first line of that song, they talk about dancing freely in the street. Back in, I want to say earlier this year, I was introduced to the first known Iranian American principal dancer. And she had explained to me that she's doing this short film and she needed my help. And in that process of helping her, we discovered an element of her story, of her discovery of the Iranian National Ballet. And when she told me, I thought to myself, what? I had no idea a country like Iran had ballet, because I obviously didn't exist at that time. And not only that, I thought to myself, how much of the history in Iran exists that we don't know about, which goes back to our first original question, where did we start and where we are now? And this past like 6 to 9 months, when we did, so the short film is called Persian Swan, and hearing Tara Ghassemieh is the principal dancer, hearing her perspective and her experience, because I'm not a dancer, I'm a journalist who pays attention to the story and understanding how I can share that with the public for them to understand. We discovered that the Iranian National Ballet existed. It was the largest ballet company in the Middle East at the time, from the 50s up until 79. And when the revolution happened, it was disbanded, and every member except for one at the time was expelled from the country. They had to leave. And not only that, they realized, well, okay, the revolution has happened, things are changing. No, I don't believe people at the time realized what the gravity of the situation was. But as we are figuring out more information, we find out that the country is trying to single-handedly erase this history. And not only that, we haven't publicly announced yet, but we'll announce here. This documentary, that short film has now turned into a feature documentary. To this day, there is no comprehensive documentary about the Iranian National Ballet. Wow. Right? That's amazing. And there is a group of over 130 plus dancers that went through the National Ballet that came from around the world. And this is going to be the first time for many of them to share their story. And I think it's really important to document this part of history, not only to document it, because, well, one challenge that we have, the government was trying to eradicate this history, right? Burning costumes, getting rid of that information, giving fear to those dancers for sharing their story, or letting them have access to come back to the country, right? And that's a common situation for a lot of Iranians. And so with the documentary, we're hoping to bring that history of the ballet company, but also we're going to be tapping into this time of Iran that was pre-revolution, going into the revolution, and what that meant for this particular part of that history. And I think with art and dance, it's a very unifying medium. So whether you are Iranian or not, any part of the world you can see, when you see someone like Tara dance or any of the ballet members share their story, we're hoping that you can unify, understand, and have empathy for what that means, and share that part of the history that for a really long time the government didn't want anyone to know.
Thank you for sharing that with us, Elle. This next question is for Ava and Nazanin. For decades now, there have been thousands of innocent people that have been killed at the hands of the regime, women, young children. We all saw the death or the murder of Neda Agha Sultan on social media and on television. Why do you suppose the death of Mahsa Jina Amini led to this call to action, but all those other deaths haven't?
That's a very good question. And I would ask myself that question. But I think it might be the timing. It might be the fact that there is social media where people can share more. I think the biggest answer to that question is the fact that people now believe inside Iran and outside Iran. As I said, I've been at this for many years. I organized rallies 15 years ago. Maybe 300 people would show up. Not 50,000 people on the streets of Vancouver, not in Toronto, 100,000 people in Berlin coming out on the streets. And then, of course, inside the country of Iran, millions of people coming out in pockets. That's the difference. I think people, whereas before they thought this regime is so brutal, their only mechanism was through violence, and that they didn't have the belief that they could rise up against such tyranny. Whereas now, I think they're empowered, seeing the level of activity, the sheer numbers of people supporting this, and finally, governmental leaders on the outside also recognizing, using words like "this is a revolution." Emmanuel Macron from France called this a revolution. Germany, one of the countries with one of the strongest economic ties with the Islamic Republic, has been one to use the harshest words against this regime and starting to sanction them. And Canada, of course, we've also listed 10,000 members of the IRGC here. We're hoping that they continue on and list the IRGC in its entirety. But finally, world leaders are taking notice, and they're saying that they're standing in solidarity with the people of Iran. So I think that might be one of the differences.
I think it's important to also remember, do you guys hear me? Is this good? Okay. So I think it's important to remember that Iranians have fought for democracy for over a century, starting with constitutional revolution. This is not something that we thought about recently. In 1979, the idea, even though it went really, really wrong, the idea was to bring justice and democracy to Iran. Ruhollah Khomeini was supposed to be only a unifying face to it, and then go away and allow the country to be led by democratic principle. Well, that was not his idea, and he took power and started executing everyone. For him to get into power, leftists, nationalists, and Islamists worked together. And then he got into power and executed everyone, right, indiscriminately. Then the war happened, which he openly called a blessing, and it was a blessing for him. He got to establish his power in the country. Then people started thinking about, what are we going to do? What we were stuck in. We just had a revolution, and look at what happened. So we need to see if we can work with what's available right now and find ways to get to some sense of normalcy. And they worked with that, and these clergies presented themselves as so-called reformists and having no other option, because people didn't want a war. They didn't want their country to be invaded. They wanted to work with these people and bring about some modification. And all of those 8 years, 16 years combined of reformists failed to bring about any real change. So then what happened? Then the latest president, in 21, his so-called election was so openly engineered, and he played a big role in the mass execution in summer 1988. So here's the people trying to work with what they have in hand, and next thing they know is the executioner officially is appointed as the president, and then he goes to the United Nations. This happened while he was in the UN trying to get back on the nuclear agreement. So people found themselves alone. There was this moment of history when Iranians realized they cannot work with their government. Their government has only been deceptive and inflexible, completely incapable of any meaningful change. And now the Western world is trying to just get on a nuclear deal and work with this government. So they realize they only have themselves to rely on and no one else. And I think that's a very important moment when you're saying, when they finally believe that we have to take care of this and no one else is out there to help us. And also it works for us that Russia, Iran's biggest ally, is steeped into war right now. It would have been very dangerous if he would be interfering with Iranian events. So it's a bunch of economic, political events that all went hand in hand for this moment to happen. And again, I'm going to go back to intersectionality. People have risen up, but this year, the Gen Z brought in a sense of unity that we were starved for. We all knew we need this solidarity, but we didn't know where to start. And Generation Z started that. They need a lot of work. They need a lot of support. It's just a start, but it's a very, very important start of solidifying the entire diverse nation.
Yes, definitely. And we have a lot of panelists who we pre-recorded because they couldn't be with us here tonight. And one of them is Zainab Salbi. She's a celebrated humanitarian, the co-founder of DaughtersForEarth.com, the chief awareness officer at FindCenter.com, and the host of a well-known podcast, Redefined. And she's also the CEO of Women for Women International. Here's a clip of her explaining how the revolution in Iran is impacting the greater region at large. Let's have a listen.
It's a huge moment. I mean, there is what's happening in Iran. There is its impact on the entire region and the Muslim world at large, and there is its impact on the narrative of future liberation movements. As you said, this is the first time in history where women's rights are at the center of a revolution and uprising that is trying to topple an oppressive regime. Usually, historically, in all liberation movements, from the Algerian revolution against the French to the Palestinian liberation movement to the Arab Spring to different parts of the world, women are told, join the national struggle, but put your rights on the side, put your demands on your rights for equality and fairness and justice and freedom on the side. We'll grant it to you once we accomplish the larger national demand. And women have always actually done that, right? That they have pushed for the larger national struggle, but then they put this, with the deal that if we get that, you'll help us get our rights. And that has never been delivered, regardless of the failure or the success of any revolution. It's never delivered. And so women's rights do not become woven into the narrative of the national liberation. This is what's happening in Iran. It is the first time where it starts, at the center of it is women's rights and freedom in all the definition of what is that rights, what is that equality, what is that freedom means as the Iranian women are defining it. A lot of people think it's just about the headscarf. It's not. It's a vast revolution, right? And centered in that, men then join into, and others join into their economic, political struggle as well, and social struggle as well. But it's centered around women's rights. Regardless of, of course, I am rooting heart and mind for Iranian women to succeed. It is so fundamentally important that they succeed. Again, not for only them, which is the most important thing, but the ripple impact that it can have on women in the region, in the Muslim world, and women all over, right? But regardless of the outcome of this revolution, this is a trendsetter. This is changing the trajectory of how liberation movements go. History is going to write about this moment in time where women led the change, basically. And so regardless of the outcome of this particular moment, and I hope and pray they will succeed, I believe they can, it's going to create a new wave of thinking about how we change oppressive regime. I just came from various visits to the region. And I interviewed a lot of women from different parts of the region, from Iraq, Jordan, Syria, Turkey, Bosnia, and everyone that I talked with, and Egypt, and everyone what I spoke with, they are like saying, we're rooting for Iranian women. Because I asked us also, I wanted them to go out in the streets and show their public demonstrations. And they're like, we can't do that because we're so scared from our own governments and their own circumstances. But we're so rooting for them, and we so need them to succeed that, forgive us for not going in the streets right now, but we're watching closely what's happening to them. That's an important one, and one that I carry with compassion as well. But it's an important observation. The second observation is that countries in surrounding region, like my own home country, Iraq, who has a new government, as a new parliament, a new government, are doing interesting things that never done before in the country. So, for example, the Minister of Education in Iraq 3 weeks ago said, for the first time in our history, said women in college have to cover their head, with a headscarf. And that's a new, for a new trajectory for Iraq. Is they're like, what are you talking about? So I think my analysis is that there is a pressure happening. Everyone is watching what's happening in Iran very carefully. Governments who are pro-Iranian regime and the pro the government in the Islamic Republic of Iran are watching and are trying to introduce new laws, as the government of Iraq has done, to support, I think, in alliance with Iranian government and their civil societies and feminists and women's rights, and are watching closely and seeing how they can support silently, because they're still scared and they still have to go through their own barriers, but watching closely and rooting for Iranian women and hoping that it will create a ripple effect on their own civil rights movement in their own countries.
Anti-regime protesters in Iran have expressed that they are looking to the outside world for help and for coverage. So, Elle, this question is for you. How has the coverage been different this time around than compared to 2009 with the Green Movement, and also 2019 where 1,500 protesters were killed?
Well, to think about this right now, we're obviously in a moment. Not to say that the 2009 and 2019 wasn't also a moment. But even when those moments happened, there was always a possibility that that feeling within the community that maybe there's not going to be a change. But this time, if you talk to any Iranian, they will tell you there is no going back, right? So already that's the first point to realize that this is not like anything else that the country or the people have ever experienced. And you think about coverage, this is something where, even through our organization, we're trying to provide resources to give that perspective of what newsrooms can do in this period of time to do the proper kind of coverage. Because as you can imagine, there certain newsrooms are not going to have an Iranian like myself to provide that perspective, right? And so, I don't know if there's any journalists or aspiring journalists in the audience, but if you are and you are someone that is in a newsroom, it's so important that in this period of time to share your point of view and your experience, because it's unique and it can help colleagues to be able to do that coverage. I know I can say a lot more. I don't want to take up too much time, but I think it's really important at this period of time to be able to have agency in sharing these stories, and if you are someone that is covering it, to do it safely as well. Because if anything, we know that this situation can bring about a lot of risks. So if there are journalists that are doing this coverage, we do provide the resources with our partners to do this in a safe way. So please feel free to reach out if that is the case.
Negar, I have to take this opportunity to just
please do,
thank people like you. If it wasn't for you at Global News pushing for some of these stories, it wouldn't be covered. Nahayat Tishush at CBC, behind the scenes also pushing at CBC Radio, Mashid, pushing. It's because the Iranian diaspora is now in different professions, raising up these issues. So we are to thank all of you journalists as well.
I second that, yeah.
Yes.
Thank you, Negar, Mashid, all of you.
And you, Elle.
Thank you, guys. That means a lot. Thank you very much. Now we're going to throw things over to Gissou Nia. She's a human rights lawyer and the director for strategic litigation with the Atlantic Council. She's going to be talking about the latest executions, which have been heavy on all our hearts, and about media coverage.
It's very sad that Mohsen Shekari's family basically learned about his execution after it happened. So the saddest thing about this is that the family purportedly was told to stay quiet, and that if they stayed quiet about what their son was going through, that he would be released. And I think the message really is that silence does not guarantee that your loved one will get out. And that is why people ultimately often publicize these cases. It's not to say that publicity always works. I think we've seen examples where it didn't, like the tragic case of Navid Afkari. But nobody to know somebody's name and for that name to not be elevated doesn't necessarily help. And here, it's really horrific that the family was subjected to that. There's now, I know that I'm doing this in a pre-recorded video, so things might change by the time this, is aired. But we're getting the details now that his family was told to bring a clean set of clothes to the prison, and there's a reaction video of when they found out, and the kind of psychological horror that involves is just really beyond comprehension. I think the bottom line is that the Islamic Republic of Iran is the leading global executioner per capita in the world. It has had that extremely horrific record for years and years. There was a brief pause in which it wasn't the number one, just because it had a moratorium on death penalty for drug-related offenses. But the bottom line is that executions are used in the Islamic Republic in a way that is not in accordance with international law. These are often the results of unfair trials. There's almost no due process guarantees. Some of these trials last less than 5 minutes and don't even have the defendant doesn't even have counsel of their own choosing. They never know the charges against them. There's these vague charges like corruption against the earth or waging war against God, and they all carry the death penalty. And unfortunately, there's 40 or so other individuals right now who have similar charges as the charges that were brought against Mohsen Shekari. And so I'm super worried that they will also be executed. I find it really interesting that the global media was so quick to talk about the 15,000 execution number. The media was so quick to talk about that, but I don't know where they are now to talk about all these young men and women that are going to be sentenced to death and put to death. It's really tragic.
Now let's move on to fears and concerns and what's actually happening right now inside the country. Nazanin and Ava, this question's for you. There are reports that nearly 100 kids, if not more, have been killed indiscriminately by the regime, a majority of those children being ethnic minorities. Can you talk to us about that?
Yes, well, Ava can talk more about the Kurdish region, but there is a massacre in Kurdistan, in Baluchistan, and Sistan. And there's heavy artillery there. There's suppression forces there shooting, as you say, indiscriminately at people. And as a result, children are in the crossfire. Some of them are killed, some of them are maimed. Many are blinded. I think I don't know the number of children comparatively, but there's over 1,500 people that have been blinded. And in fact, the suppression forces have been asked to target people's eyes, and they've been asked to target women's faces, breasts, and genitalia as a misogynist way of suppression. And the children, of course, they're innocent. You know, they're coming home from, shopping, and they just get shot. Or these suppression forces are shooting directly into people's homes, and children are on the balcony or in their homes, and they're being shot at. And of course, they're also being condemned to execution. Let's not forget that the definition of a child under the United Nations is under the age of 18, and Iran is signatory to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the Convention on the Charter of the Rights of the Child, which forbids the execution of anybody under the age of 18. And yet, as we see, they still condemn children to execution. There's 2 children right now since the death of Mahsa Amini who have been condemned to execution. So this is the reality.
That's very well said. I just want to remind everyone that Iranian kids are not the only kids killed by the Iranian government. They also have the blood of a lot of Yemenis kids, Syrian kids, Iraqi kids on their hand. So it is of service to the entire region and to the global community if we can get rid of a government who kills indiscriminately. And as Nazanin pointed out about directly shooting at people's houses and the different treatment that Iranian gets, blanks were used in Tehran, real bullets were used in Kurdistan. Wall Street Journal reported on convoys of military vehicles loaded with troops heading toward Kurdistan. There have been reports of fighter jets and tanks. And so the way they treat ethnic minorities, they treat them as if we're not part of the same country. It's not just, there are fascists everywhere, but they act like complete occupiers when they're dealing with people elsewhere.
I just have to add one more thing. As we're talking about juveniles as well, not only are they indiscriminately shot at, but they're also beaten on the head on purpose. They're sent to jails, and in the jails they're also faced with rape, both men and women, girls and boys. And this is, again, a tool that's used. So I had to just mention that.
Yeah. Of course. And a regime that can kill children, what does that say about the regime itself?
I think they've been rotting from inside for a while now. I think the only reason they have stayed in power for 43 years is their brutality. There is a second reason, and that's the lack of a viable alternative. But really, the main reason they've stayed in power because of how extremely brutal they can get. And at this moment in life, the supreme leader Khamenei himself took part of the 1979 revolution. And he realized that that revolution succeeded because at one point, he killed a lot of people, but at one point he decided he's done with killing. The question is, would supreme leader have this moment when he would say, I'm done with killing? I doubt it. Every decision he has ever made in terms of dealing with the international community, with the nuclear agreement, in terms of his lack of flexibility working with the reformists, every decision this guy has ever made, and he has been in power 4 times as much as his predecessor, has been about him staying in power. But the good point right now is that 2 things. First of all, because he's so power thirsty, there isn't any possible substitute for him right now. And he's 83-year-old and he's not in the best health condition. So this is near the end of his life, and his only way to remain in his power is by killing and killing and killing. But that has weakened the government. Lack of replacement for him has really weakened them, and they've been rotting for decades now.
Earlier this week, we spoke with Dr. Tahirih Danesh from the United Kingdom. She's a human rights law professor as well as a socioeconomic rights expert, and she talked to us about where you can find these reports and responses in terms of the children.
I was literally pregnant with my second child when I approached my co-panelist, who is, I believe, in person among us today, Nazanin Afshin-jam. I approached her on behalf of the Foreign Policy Center here in the UK, and we arranged to bring our work together in this area in the form of a report that I helped to co-author and present as the first evidence-based policy report on the subject of child execution in several spaces, including UN processes, to highlight this horrific atrocity. What we keep hearing come out of Iranian space, whether it's death in custody or induced death after custody or executions, rock everyone's reality in horrific ways. So I think what we could do, not just people like me, all of us, I invite you to actually read the policy recommendations that are at the conclusion of the report that we put together back in 2009. Many of them, if not all, stand valid to this day. Please read these recommendations because they're tiered recommendations. You can use them at different levels. Please approach your provincial and national authorities to incorporate these recommendations in their work regarding Iran. But more importantly, perhaps, let us help identify those living in Canada now who are responsible for these executions. And through legal channels, bring them to account. These mechanisms, these legal channels are available to you in Canada. And there are experts at UBC in particular, where, as we know, one of our former United Nations Special Rapporteurs on Human Rights in Iran, Professor Maurice Copythorne, who was our Special Rapporteur from 1995 to 2002, he was at UBC. And there are many of his colleagues who are still there. Please consult together. Please find mechanisms that as a community, you can come together, find out who these individuals are, choose what mechanism you want to use, whether it's truth and reconciliation or we need to maybe approach it in a different way. Let's do it. It's not only necessary, again, as part of transitional justice, but it's incredibly cathartic for our community that has suffered for more than 4 decades, facing execution after execution.
And the links that Dr. Danesh had mentioned will be uploaded to the events page tomorrow if you'd like to check it out. Soushiant, this question's for you. Sure. What can governments here and around the world do to stop these executions?
Yeah, okay. So I think that you need to keep in mind that there's a particular strategy the IRI has deployed over many, many years to overwhelm activists and advocates with the volume of atrocities. So by focusing on one name, for example, Mohsen Shekari or Majid Reza or whoever is next, you get overwhelmed by the next one and the next one. So one thing that we've become aware of is the German parliament has begun a campaign to sponsor a prisoner. And I think what they're trying to do is decentralize responsibility so that each prisoner is receiving proportional attention from people. With the support of other activists and advocates, they're being given briefing documents, social media, reels, and pictures so that they can keep their keep attention on those folks. But I think that's at a micro level. At a macro level, I think Western governments need to set some really strong, hard red lines. Action, reaction. So if you do these types of things, you can't really say we're against capital punishment because capital punishment happens in many, many different countries. But what we're really against is capital punishment without due process, without the presence of lawyers, without, the ability to scrutinize the evidence by a third party. Those are really, missing institutional processes. And I think, Western governments have a few options. If they can build a case for sanctioning the prosecutor and the judge in those cases for malpractice or whatever, putting them on sanctions list, really good action. But many might hide behind the fact that they can't sort of meet that level of evidence. They need to recall ambassadors, in my opinion. They need to create a disincentive for doing this. I think Canada absolutely needs to publicly call on its allies to stop nuclear negotiations until these executions come to a halt. 100% we need to do this as a moral obligation. And if we can't recall ambassadors, we need to downgrade diplomatic relations in every country there are. So those are some things that come to mind that are practical and bear costs. The one thing I'd like to say about the issue about executions is, I don't know if many of you are aware, there are people in this room whose families have gone through this process without nearly as much, theatrics and crafting as you sort of see right now. Meaning, there was nothing more than muharabeh, the waging war against God as the thing. Now you're seeing them fabricate these crimes of them killing Basijis and so on and so forth. The Islamic Republic, from my reading of it, is extremely sensitive to being delegitimized outside of the country. They're trying to portray a image that our systems and processes are fine. This is the way things are here. It's culturally relevant. And there are legitimate reactions for the actions they took. They are very sensitive to being delegitimized. We need to do everything in our power to scrutinize this and undermine this and, I think, show how hollow it is.
Can I just quickly
Yeah, for
add
sure.
something?
Go ahead, please.
To that point that they're trying to be legitimate, that's why they exaggerated the abolishment of morality police too. So for as long as they do pay attention, because they have followed this double policy when they try to tell the Western world that, oh, we're working with our people, whereas in fact they just double down on repression. And the other thing we can do is putting pressure on these big tech companies to help people circumvent the internet blockage, because that's a serious problem right now for those of us who work with the activists within the country and with people. So if we could get all these powerful, because Elon Musk made these big claims about Starlink, but Starlinks would only work if you have the towers there, and so it was impossible in case of Iran.
Let's have a listen now to what Zainab, Salbi, and Gissou
There's
have to
one
say about
simple
this.
ask that I have for all governments right now, which is to support a resolution to take Iran out, to take the Islamic Republic of Iran out from serving on the Commission on the Status of Women at the United Nations. There are many countries that are supportive of that and agree to give their vote, and there are many countries who have not. And it's interesting when I look at the countries who have not. Some are stopping for bureaucratic reasons, but some think that this is an American initiative, which it is not. So my ask of everyone who actually is particularly from some African countries or Latin American countries or European countries to go to their countries, to put pressure on their foreign ministries and say that this demand that we kick Iran out from the serving in the Commission on the Status of Women at the UN is coming out of Iranian women, from Iranian women inside of Iran. This is not, some Western agenda trying to hijack this amazing revolution. This is in response to their demand. And we're finding that once we clarify that to a lot of governments, it does make a difference. In a time where there's a lot of anti-American sentiment, that clarification that this is coming out of it's a show of support out of for Iranian women, as asked by Iranian women, makes a difference. So I'm hoping, that's what everyone put their pressure on right now. But beyond that, honestly, this is for the government, and all of us are part of that. All of us can do whatever we can do to call the ministries of foreign affairs. I'm picking up the call and the phone and calling as many people as I know to help me in that, right? But also to keep the momentum going. We cannot interfere in what's happening in Iran, but we can make sure that the voices of Iranian women and girls are echoed in our streets and in our media every single day, that we do not forget that. That's the least we can do. That's, just make sure that drum beats are kept on beating as they are risking their lives and getting killed and imprisoned and all of that, and not giving up on demanding for the change that they want. The only thing we can do is echo their voices, ensure that it stays in the front pages, and make sure that our governments support this new UN resolution.
I think that there is, condemnation and written condemnation, and then there's like stronger action that involves countries that have, embassies in Iran, or, have some sort of form of bilateral relations and bilateral dialogue, actually saying something. Obviously, there's the suggestions from Iranians in Iran themselves to expel diplomats, and there's a range of actions that can be taken. And I think it's incredibly important. I think the reason why we see repetition here is because oftentimes like strong action is not taken. And action can be taken in the form of cutting funding for specific programs, or there's a lot of different types of actions that could be taken. I do think it's critically important now that this is elevated as like a really horrific development, and that there's a real push for it to come to an end. I think that's one of the biggest areas that require.
Elle, journalists are under attack in Iran. Can you tell us about how people can support journalists in Iran and how you're showing your support?
Sure. So, Iran, just to give you some perspective, the Reporters Without Borders puts out a report every year. And the ranking is out of 180. And Iran is 178, meaning the press freedom ranking for Iran is one of the worst in the entire world, right? And what does that mean? It means you don't have access to information. Journalists cannot vet information. They can't do their work properly. And so that's what we're seeing in Iran, especially in this last few months. Many journalists have been arrested. Majority of them, more than half, I wouldn't say, are women, female journalists. Let's not forget the reason why we learned about Mahsa was by 2 female journalists. Because they brought truth to light. And imagine being able to do that without the level of press freedom like someone like me would have in the United States. And now they're paying for that because they're in prison. Things like this are important to bring attention to show support for. There are organizations, nationally, internationally. I know we're here in Canada. I represent an organization in the United States. But we do a lot of work globally, and we have a lot of partners to be able to find support and to connect journalists to be able to do their work in a way that they're not going to be put in prison, to be killed, and everything in between. And so it's really important to show that support. And with our organization, we provide these resources in order for journalists to be able to do their work in a way that they're free to do that.
Thank you for the work that you do. Soushiant, can you talk about the recommendations you make in your change.org campaign against the IRGC?
Sure. So I came together with a group of different people, entrepreneurs, policymakers, lawyers, after I'd written an op-ed about a month and a half or so ago in the Toronto Star, calling Canada that it sort of still remains a safe haven for a lot of regime insiders. There were many public reports that had come out on in the National Post by Terry Glavin and others, sharing how the son of the vice president of Iran was building a tech startup here, that the granddaughter of Ayatollah Khomeini goes to school in U of T, and so on and so forth. Many, many examples, right? Granddaughter of Ayatollah Mezboyazdi talking shit to people and protesters and things like this, right? So, these things are quite infuriating when you see them, but the goal, it wasn't to be punitive, was to sort of look at it systematically. If the government of Canada is calling this country, the Islamic Republic, the largest state sponsor of terrorism, for fomenting terrorism in and out of the region, deploying it on its own people, surely the folks, the executive members of that government are the people carrying out these plans. They should surely be labeled with the same sort of designations. And if they're labeled with the same designations, then maybe it's not a good idea that they travel freely anywhere they want, especially here. So we put some demands together, and primarily the demand came from the banking and investment sector. In that sector, there might be a few people here that know this, but if you're going to take a penny from a new client in an investment fund, you have to run their name across a list called the Politically Compromised Groups and Individuals list. Meaning if they have any sensitive political connections, their father is a president or uncle is a somebody, you can't take their money. Our existing compliance and systems here in Canada have this level of scrutiny, whereas our immigration system has a very different level of scrutiny. So what we're asking for in that petition is to sort of level up. If we think that it's a bad idea for them to bring their money and do this sort of stuff here, maybe it's a bad idea for that to be not part of the screening criteria for entering the country. So there's 8 demands that we make in the petition. I won't bore you with the details, but please go check it out. It's gotten 65,000 signatures. The goal, we've had a lot of private conversations with parliamentarians behind the scenes to get this to 100,000 signatures, and then take it to the next stage, which is either a parliamentary petition by parliamentarians or a joint task force to begin looking at how they execute on the plans that we've made there, which is asset seizure, asset repurposement, and deportation of those that came here under false pretenses.
Thank you, Soushiant. Now let's move. Yes, thank you. Now let's move things on to, where do we go from here, how people can help, and a call to action. Nazanin, you were in New York recently for the Eyes on Iran campaign. Can you talk to us about that and its significance in terms of bringing a call to action?
Sure. In fact, there's a couple of people here that were with me in New York a couple of weeks ago, Elle and Nikta. We were there for the Eyes on Iran campaign. As you saw, Zainab, Salbi, and Gissou were also with us there. We had a presentation overlooking the United Nations at Four Freedoms Park, and it was a huge art installation by Shirin Neshat and other Iranian artists showcasing their art. And the whole point was to keep our eyes on Iran, to pressure global media to keep their eyes on Iran, and to pressure our global decision makers to continue keeping their eyes on Iran. And the featured guest there was Hillary Clinton, and she used some pretty powerful words showcasing her solidarity with Iranian people. Now, that was a second part to the first part, which is actually more important, which was a petition to put pressure on the United Nations to take Iran off of the Commission for the Status of Women. And what we've done as a coalition of Iranian women in concert with Four Freedoms and Vital Voices was to do just that. And we sent some of the ambassadors, Gissou, and a few other Iranian activists, went to different nation states and pressured those that are sitting on the Economic and Social Council to vote in favor of the motion to take Iran off of the CSW. And the vote is tomorrow. So tomorrow we are going to find out if, for the first time in history, something that's unprecedented, whether this is going to happen. And I mean, I can think of nothing better symbolically to delegitimize the Islamic regime than to take them off. As you were mentioning polls, Iran ranks 143 out of 146 on the gender gap index. So it's a real shame to see the Islamic Republic on a commission like that, who's supposed to give recommendations to other nation states on how to, treat women and how to improve the rights of women. So if the United Nations wants to legitimize themselves again, they should do the right thing and pressure these member states to vote in the right direction. That's just one way. Now, if I could just add to the list of wonderful recommendations that Soushiant made in terms of what we can do as global leaders. I mean, in Canada, we are a soft power, but we have a lot of influence. And one thing that we can do within our borders is push on the Magnitsky Act and putting asset freezes and travel bans on not just regime officials, but their families as well. And I think Ali Essasi, MP Ali Essasi and Senator Ratna Omidvar are creating a parliamentary group. Are they doing that with you, Soushiant, to move forward with potentially seizing the assets of these regime officials and repurposing them in a way that will benefit either the victims of this Islamic Republic or in a manner that will help this revolution, whether in a strikers fund or perhaps even, spending the money on technology and communication to help the Iranian people disseminating the news and being able to plan the next set of protests.
Let me just share. There's a technicality with Magnitsky Act where in order to get on the Magnitsky Act, you need to be first identified as a perpetrator of human rights abuses. And then they need to qualify that with some kind of evidence. Then Foreign Affairs will introduce you onto that list. The problem is that most of the people on that list are already transferring assets to their family members who are not on those lists and not subject to our laws. However, I'm not a big fan of Harper, but the one thing his government did during that time was introduce a bill called, I believe, S-217. It's in the petition. Please go and check out the petition. But in that act, he's asked for an expansion of Magnitsky to include family members of those people. So it's not just individual, but prodigy. And if that happens, which there's legal framing of that, it's been introduced in Senate. So we're asking for this to happen. If that happens, a lot can change. And not only here, the goal is for this to expand into Australia, New Zealand, and other quote-unquote safe havens for the regime. This will blow a massive shock to them.
And a link to the vote is on our event page. And as Nazanin mentioned, Zainab Salbi was also at the Eyes on Iran campaign in New York, and here's what she had to say.
Many different women's organizations who are doing everything they can to support Iranian women. So that's important. So if you are an organizer in your university and everywhere, please sign the petition. Go to womenlifefreedom.today and sign the petition. Call your government to push them to do that, to support the resolution, and keep do anything that will get the media attention for Iranian women. I am doing that. Earlier this week, I was part of artists all over the world coming together in front of at the Freedom Park in front of the UN, launching Eyes on Iran, an exhibit, a multimedia exhibit, an art exhibit to put pressure on the UN, saying we are watching you and we're demanding that of you. You speak in as many events as possible. You riot, you demonstrate, you mobilize other women to ask them for their support. You do all you can, and that's what I'm doing. As many other women are doing that too.
On November 24th, the United Nations held an emergency summit on Iran, and an unprecedented resolution was passed. Gissou was there, and here's a little bit of what she had to say about her time there.
There was a special session of the UN Human Rights Council that was called on November 24th. Germany and Iceland, who are both members of the Human Rights Council at the moment, co-led this call for a special session. This is the 35th, it was the 35th special session of the Human Rights Council. So for those who don't know, there's regular sessions of the Human Rights Council, and they'll meet in February, March, and at other points during the year, about three times a year, usually sometimes 4. And a special session is when there's such an emergency that they're going to call one on an exceptional basis. So in the past, there were special sessions on Sudan, Afghanistan, Syria, Ethiopia, but there had not ever been one for Iran. And so this was very important. And usually at a special session, there's a resolution that has some kind of outcome. And so the idea, we were calling for an investigative independent mechanism, which would document human rights violations that are being committed by the authorities. What resulted was a fact-finding mission, what's known as the FFM. It has somewhat of a limited mandate, and that is only going to document what happened since the time of the protests that began in September. But it's really important because there has been no other action taken by the Human Rights Council and to set up a mandate, a mechanism, or a procedure that's specific to Iran since 2011. That was when the mandate for the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Iran was set up, and nothing has happened in the 11 years since then until this fact-finding mission. And the fact-finding mission will really aid a lot of us in our work. So civil society organizations have basically been leading the investigations into abuses committed by the Islamic Republic. And when it comes to accountability processes, like, for example, the Hamid Nouri trial that happened in a Swedish district court and which resulted in his conviction this past July, that really relied on the work of civil society organizations and people's courts. Up till now, there was no international body that was looking into investigations of human rights violations and atrocity crimes in Iran. So this is a big first, and it will hopefully feed the present and future accountability processes that we want to see on this. We hope that it might have some aspect of a deterrent effect if the Islamic Republic knows that the world is watching them closely and collecting all this information. And very importantly, a lot of this information is open source information, basically video, photo, that's disseminated over social media. And there's a process for geolocating that, for verifying that, for doing chronolocation. And so a team of experienced folks will be doing that, and doing that at a level that courts can rely on, which is just critically important. It's different than an awareness function. It's an accountability function. So obviously I'm thrilled for that. It's just the first step, but I'm thrilled that that outcome was so positive and that we got 25 yes votes in favor of this fact-finding mission. And it's not just from Western states, it was from the Latin America bloc, the Africa bloc, the Asia bloc. So that is widespread global support. The Islamic Republic loves to say that all of this is like Western intervention, this and the other. It couldn't be farther from the truth. The truth is that the globe sees what the Islamic Republic is doing to its youth, doing to women and girls, doing to its marginalized ethnic communities. Like, they see what they're doing. And the feeling, yeah, a great feeling. I mean, It's not going to bring back anybody who's been killed, the more than 400 individuals. I mean, it's way more than that, but the ones that we know of, the 400 individuals killed by the Islamic Republic in this violence, it's not going to bring them back. It's not going to bring back the 60 children that have been killed since these protests started, but it will at least help pave out a path for accountability, and one that wasn't previously open to us.
Homa, how do you envision a free and democratic Iran?
I very much like to think about the possibility of a bottom-top democracy, where instead of leader telling people what they need and what should be done, people would get together in councils. And I think those councils, just looking at example of Rojava, shouldn't be made official until at least 40% of them are women. People can get together in these councils and decide what they need, and they would be the one who would tell their leaders what they need and what has to be done. I envision a society that values justice for people and for environment. I envision a society that is capable to finally bring to center peoples that it has pushed to the margin for centuries. I think democracy is a process. It doesn't happen overnight. I think it's as much of an external process as it is an internal process. And that's something we can practice today. We don't have to wait for these brutal government to run away before we start practicing that. How do we make room for opposing views? How do we listen and acknowledge the mistakes that we have made? How do we try to make amends? I mean, this beautiful country we call home, Canada, has gone a long way in reconciliations. What can we learn from the society that they can bring into our own societies, and start with a healing process, with a reckoning and reconciliation?
Definitely, there's so much trauma people have been experiencing for decades now that are really coming to surface. Let's have a listen to Dr. Danesh talk about that grassroots democracy.
One of the things that I think in terms of developing a new understanding of democracy is important for us is to be very clear that democracy is about grassroots. But very often in our approach to democracy, including this particular movement that has started, we pay lip service to grassroots and democracy, but we go for grass tops. We immediately try to identify known faces, usually political faces or activist faces, that we could hold on to and say, this person's leading us. But this is not necessarily constructive. Although we need everybody, we actually need a conglomerate of ethically and technically educated Iranians, both in Iran and among the diaspora, to adopt a civic and constructive approach by placing the common weal or common interests and goals at the heart of our everyday actions, interactions, and transactions. One of the things that's very important in making that happen, and to really access democracy, I feel, is that we need to modify our fixation with the 1979 revolution and pay closer attention to the 1980 cultural revolution, because it was during that process that specific deficiencies were institutionalized and became part of state policy in Iran. And so I think we need to identify those particular deficiencies in ourselves and in our society, and find out the best ways to train and educate our children and our teens with characteristics and capabilities that get rid of these deficiencies and create enablement in them to engage in creative and meaningful acts that actually advance their individuality, their self, and our collective society, with a strong focus, I feel, again, on ethical and corruption-free outlets for the amazing qualities of creativity that the next gen Iranians possess, particularly in the arts and entrepreneurship. That includes civic entrepreneurship, I should emphasize, because we're specifically talking about democracy. And I think we really need to be open to sifting through the rest of the world and adopting best practices, because a democracy is not just, you know, an administrative system. It needs all different ingredients for this system to work. So, for instance, could we look at post-genocidal Rwanda, that is now becoming the fintech capital of Africa and the woman-led national administration of the continent? And this leaderless movement will redefine democracy, will be different than any other model we've ever seen. So we have to be open to new concepts and ideas that have not yet captured our imagination. Global exploration with a direct reference to our civilization will enable us to redefine democracy and access it in a way that works for a multi-ethnic, multi-belief, and multi-class society.
Elle, what about you? How do you envision a free and democratic Iran?
Well, from my perspective, press freedom is really important. Do I imagine and do I want the ability to see an Iran that has a higher rating than 170, 178? Yes. If we have that foundation, then we have a foundation for everything else, all the other freedoms we're looking for. It's interesting because I know my perspective here is to share the journalistic approach or my point of view, but I'm also Iranian, right? First generation born in the US. The kind of free Iran I'd like to see is to have that freedom to go back to a place that is part of my identity. Something that I wasn't afforded my entire life. I mean, there is that experience, but it isn't without its stresses. I'd like for there to be a situation where if I'm coming at it from the point of view as an Iranian who wasn't able to grow up in a country that is a part of my identity, to be able to have that ability to do that at some point in my lifetime, to do it in a way where I can connect to that culture that is a part of me, and have that for others as well.
Speaking of identity and image, we spoke to comedian and actor Maz Jobrani, and he told us about how, in his opinion, the image of an identity of what it means to be Iranian has changed since this revolution. Let's have a listen.
A lot of times post-revolution, it's not as simple as one would hope. And sometimes revolutions don't succeed. So we see that in some of the Arab Spring countries. But then you look at some countries where you go, oh, they had an authoritarian state. And many years later, they seem to have made progress towards accepting all of their citizens. So you look at a place like Spain that had a dictator, Franco, I think to the late 70s. You look at South Africa and apartheid. You look at even places like Argentina and other places where dictators, Chile, where dictators have existed. But after several years, the people have said that's enough. And the hope is that the Iranian people can agree to accept each other. Iran is a diverse country, even though it's united as Iran. There are many different ethnic groups, and hopefully they all will respect each other. Hopefully they will respect each other's religions. Hopefully they will respect each other's sexuality, whatever it is. That's what I think is a democratic society. And the unfortunate thing is we see in the West even currently there's a pushback to democracy and diversity, and there's a push towards totalitarianism. And it's dangerous, especially when you combine it with something that's, when you mix religion in. it can become an extremist ideology where if you don't agree with me, then I will imprison you and I will execute you. So hopefully the people of Iran will come up with a government that is accepting of all Iranians.
Maz also talked about how when he first immigrated to the United States from Iran, how people would, especially after the U.S. hostage crisis, accuse him of being a terrorist and name called him growing up. And now, since this revolution, anywhere he goes and he says he's Iranian, people clap for him. and it's all thanks, he said, to Iranian women.
Yes.
So that's good to hear. Soushiant, let's talk about, there's been talk of a coalition. What would that look like, and how can people make such a thing happen?
This never appearing, miracle that we're all waiting for, the coalition. Frankly, I don't really care if it, who is part of it and what it constitutes. There's some basic principles I hope that will be abided by if it's created. What I care most about is what it does in its first 100 days, which I will maybe share a couple of ideas for. So first, I think that it can't be exclusionary. It needs to be inclusive. At least invitations need to be given to all different factions to have some representation in it. And if they want to come, they come. If they don't, they don't. I think it also needs to have mechanisms to be inclusive beyond the walls of the council, because Iranians, there's 6 million of us that live outside the country, 85 in the country. There are a lot of brilliant ideas that need to compete against each other for attention. We can't just, at least it's not my philosophy to sort of have a few loud voices dictate everything on everyone's behalf. So the other thing is, like, if anyone here has gone into business in some kind of partnership, the first thing you do in a partnership is decide how you will settle disagreements before you start the partnership. What is the governance process for settling disagreements? And what is the circumstances under which the partnership disbands? I think those are really important things to agree upon right up front, whoever that council looks like, so that everyone's on the same page that this is the mandate and this is the scope of activity of this council. I think that what the council does is very, very important. And while some believe it might get us to free and fair elections, I think we need to focus on this phase, which is the success of a revolution. I think that right off the bat, this council needs to have a really strong strategic think group that scans every single nonviolent attempt of revolution in the past 100 years and looks at every reason why those things failed so that we don't repeat those same mistakes. I think that it needs to set up another expert committee of every single leader that's been part of nonviolent revolution attempts that are non-Iranian to join and provide perspectives on this one that we're going through. The other thing I think it needs to do is raise hundreds of millions of dollars and hire a PR firm to make sure that we're the top piece of news in every news outlet out there. I think these are really, really important first steps of this council. But basically, the point of the council, whoever, again, it is to wrestle back legitimacy. This is a fight for legitimacy. We have two Irans right now. We have the government and we have the will of the people being reflected in so many different ways. All of us out here are trying to legitimize the will of the people in creative ways. This council needs to demonstrate that it has legitimacy and a political alternative that's different than there, so that it can go and begin negotiating with Western governments, negotiating with tech companies, negotiating with other people. I think the council needs a CEO as well. Anyways.
And Nazanin, this question's for you. There are a lot of diverse perspectives. How can we create unity without compromising pluralism?
a good question as well. Just based on what Soushiant was, we've had many conversations about what leadership would look like, or a coalition, or a lot of people are afraid of even the word coalition because it entitles bringing forth political parties, which of course we don't have that luxury inside Iran to form political parties. So it looks more like a accumulation of active individuals and groups that have formed throughout the years. I kind of see this more from a bird's eye view perspective. Again, since I've been in this area for a long time, I've formed a lot of partnerships, alliances, friendships with a lot of people from right to left. And whereas there has been a lot of fragmentation in our community for a long time, I think this revolution has forced some more unity. I see a lot of hope and beauty in that. Even Soushiant and I had disagreements in the past on ways to move forward with Iran, and yet we were together last night thinking of action plans for the future of Iran. And in our little group that we were meeting with, there was members of the NDP, strong liberals, strong conservatives, and yet we had the same vision for Iran, a free and democratic Iran, separation of religion and state, a constitution based on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, you know, things that and an end to this regime, of course. And I think that's where we are all united. We are all united in the fact that we want these things. We may have different approaches, but there's ways of uniting us together. And as I said, I've been meeting with different groups, and I see how each group and individual, strong, intelligent, there's so much resources in our community. There's just so much brain power. If we can bring these pieces of the puzzle together, then we can form a very strong alliance. You don't call it a coalition if you don't want it, but a network where we're not doubling up on some of our actionable projects. We can work together and form synergies. And one of the next ways to do this, among other groups that have come up with this, is to maybe form some kind of conference or expo, whether online or in person, where people can learn from one another and know what people are doing in this field and where there are still gaps. And I think in that capacity, we won't have to rely on these messiah figures that a lot of people have been calling. I mean, we all know the names. They've been calling for Masih Ali-Nejad and Reza Pahlavi and Hamed Esmailion. All those people are strong beyond words. And if we can bring those people together, all the better. But we can't be waiting around. We need to start forming. We need to start forming these think tanks and committees with strong subject matter experts together. And I do have a lot of hope for the future of Iran. Now, let's not forget the real leaders are inside Iran, in Evin prison, and there's even leaders. We call this a leaderless revolution, but really there are leaders in the mahal, like in the streets. And our goal on the outside of Iran is to echo and amplify their voices and form some kind of unity project so that when there is the transition, then we can incorporate, of course, the real leaders who are inside the country.
Very well said, Nazanin. Is there anything each one of you would like to add? Just about anything? And
I think it's very important for me to remind us that all of this, you know, within Iran, people are risking their lives and they're chanting in support of each other, be it men in support of women, ethnic groups in support of each other. And there's this diaspora community that comes together and tries to do something, but more often than not, ethnic voices are erased from those coalition. And that's not just an injustice to the ethnic minority, that's a defeat for the movement. The movement of Iranian people will be successful when it actually represents all the Iranian people within that country.
So I get asked a lot about what can we do, right? Whether you're Iranian or non-Iranian, what can we do to support? For Iranians, I want to have a message of saying that take agency of telling your story, of sharing other stories. Because if not you, then who? And if not now, then when? And this is that time for you to come and do that and to give that perspective that is very unique. And for those that are non-Iranian that are still having questions of, you know, the history, what's going on now, take micro actions and do the research or have a, you know, reach out to an Iranian and ask them to tell you about their experience. These small micro actions can mean so much. It's so easy to feel overwhelmed, to feel like you have to do the most extreme things to feel like you've made an impact. But really, you can do the smallest things and can have such a ripple effect. And let's not forget that, because right now the Iranian community is a community that's going through a trauma, right? And everyone deals with trauma differently. So to not judge one another, to support one another, and to do that in a way where it doesn't trigger anyone else is so important. And I think that's going to be something that's really important going forward. Thank you.
All right. I want to share two observations. And I know you're probably bored and want to go have drinks and stuff, but this might be the last time to say them. So I want to echo what you're saying, Elle, about kind of stepping into your power. I don't think anybody gave any of us a license to act. I think all of us sort of, I'll speak for myself, like no one gave me a role or title or anything like this. I just sort of picked up the phone one night and called Negar and said, why is the media not covering the Sharif University case? And she's like, are you available at 8 a.m. tomorrow morning to talk about it? And I was like, shit, I have to do something. So nobody asked Shervin to create that song. Nobody asked many other people to step into their moment. But like, we're just seeing, all of us have a lot of endowments, and there are moments for us to step into it. And not everyone needs to mobilize. A lot of people need to have conversations, practice democracy, practice nonviolent communication, constructive disagreement. These things that we want to sort of create in the future, we don't have them in our culture right now. We need to graduate out of the culture that we've grown up in. And, you know, step into your own power, create content, tell your story, do little things. Those little things lead to much bigger things. They inform the culture we want in the future. The last thing I'd say is, working in this field, one structural thing that I saw working with different groups was, as a community, as a diaspora, we have very, very low emotional maturity. We've had it in many cases, and one example was Nazanin and I having quite a not a great kind of exchange about stuff, right? Not the best hour for either of us, right? Unless we reconcile those things, own our own limitations, there's no magic democracy that's going to happen in Iran. Okay, there's not even going to happen here. We can't even have very strong disagreements here. We need to be able to do that and walk away and say, we had a disagreement, we had a constructive disagreement, we agreed to disagree, whatever. We need to be able to get there, because if we don't, we can't build institutions and procedural integrity on top of those things. We can't just be with the people we want, right? These are things that we have a lot of opportunity to work on, and there's plenty to do. don't look for leaders, please. Step up and lead yourselves. Everyone needs it. Everyone will be inspired by it too.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And so tomorrow is the big vote to potentially take the Islamic Republic out of the United Nations Women's Rights Commission. Here's a clip from Gissou about a call to action and what people in Canada can do to help.
One of the things that we were working on was meeting with member states on the Human Rights Council to encourage them vote yes for that fact-finding mission in Geneva. I'm now in New York this week because we are meeting with member states on ECOSOC, the UN's Economic and Social Council, who will be voting on Wednesday, December 14th, on whether or not the Islamic Republic of Iran should be removed from the UN Commission on the Status of Women. The CSW, as it's called, is supposed to be the top global body promoting women's empowerment and gender equality. So it's an absolute joke that the Islamic Republic of Iran, which is a complete outlier globally when it comes to women's rights, because every country deals with misogyny, patriarchy, and so on. But the Islamic Republic of Iran actually has gender discrimination enshrined into its laws. If you look at the international criminal definition of apartheid, it arguably meets the standard for committing apartheid. It's a gender apartheid state. So the idea that they would have any leadership function on this body is absolutely ridiculous. And Iranian women inside Iran, some very brave women's rights activists, basically asked us what we could do about it. And so we said that we'll get them removed. So this is unprecedented. I don't know if the vote will be successful this coming Wednesday, but we sure hope it is. Effort to tell, your foreign ministry, depending on what country you're in. Canada is actually a member of ECOSOC, and we know that they'll be voting yes because Melanie Joly and Chrystia Freeland both signed on to a public letter calling for the removal of the IRI from the CSW. But, if you have networks in other countries, just Google ECOSOC countries, you'll see who's on the list. It's 54 member states. Urge them to vote yes tomorrow.
And now I'd like to turn our attention to Amir Bajakian. Amir Bajakian is an Iranian-Canadian activist. He's an advocate, and he spent a number of years advocating for other people. And sadly, now he has to advocate for himself. His cousin, Semiramis Babai, was kidnapped from her home, detained, and taken to Evin prison, which is where she is currently being imprisoned. We'd like to hear from Amir Bajakian right now about trying to raise awareness for what is happening to his cousin. And so welcome, Amir, to the stage.
Thank you. Last Monday at 4:30 a.m., I couldn't sleep. I checked my phone, and I got the news that Semiramis Babai, my cousin, was arrested in Tehran, and she's now in Evin prison at Ward 209. Semiramis Babai is an award-winning theater critic. She also translated various books by Tom Stoppard, Scott Fitzgerald, and James Thurber. But to me, as someone who grew up with her, she's a rebel, a fighter, she's witty and funny, and most important of all, she's a free thinker. The regime wants to dim the beacons of light who defy their darkness, the darkness that they created for us for 4 decades. It is about putting, for me, this is about putting a story to the name of people that we hear every day that they're arrested and they are suffering injustices in prisons. It is to remind us who they are and who we are. It is about reminding us of the change makers who want to make a difference for their people and for the world. And they themselves are the same as us. be it Iranian, Canadian. And this is a fight for us, for humanity. We're all in this together, be it Iranian or Canadian, be it here in Vancouver or in Tehran, in Kurdistan, in Baluchistan. Over the past week, I tried to raise awareness, having interviews with different media outlets. And a lot of times I felt powerless. And I told that to my counselor. She asked me, what would you wish to do? And I said, I wish I could go to Tehran, go to Evin, open her prison cell, and take her out with me. And I wish I could do that for every one of those prisoners. Because it doesn't make sense for 8 people to come to your home at night, to use your brother's phone to send you a fake message that your mother is not feeling well. And then you come home and they take you. And at the same time, they take 3 of her other friends, Hero Sheikh al-Islami, Pegah Gholami, Hero Sheikh al-Islami, Ahmad Gholami, and Pegah Mombini. And they're all in prison. Let us remember that this is this is about remembering the fact that silence is not the answer in this battle. Please remember that. And please say the names. Please tell the story of the prisoners. As I have a friend here, a mentor, Mr. Fred Soufi, he always reminds us about talking about political prisoners. It's important to make sure that they're not forgotten, because that's what the regime wants. Thank you.
Thank you, Amir. We're so sorry for what you're going through, your family, your cousin, and all the other political prisoners inside Iran right now. You're right, silence is not the answer. Now we're going to throw things over to question and answer, where you folks get to ask your questions. And I'm going to throw things over to our moderators for that portion of this event, Ali and Melody.
Thank you so much, organizers, attendees, panelists, moderators. A really special event to be here tonight. Maybe you could start with one question that's audience has asked. And I think, Soushiant, you talked about inclusiveness. You know, we are a fairly fragmented society. Does that inclusiveness include people that have some feelings for this regime? They have very strong, maybe Islamic ideologies that has some resemblance, as well as MacKay, the Mojtahedi Khalq. How do we include that in our inclusiveness in your potential coalition?
Thanks for the softball. So I was reading a thread today on Twitter from a Syrian activist who had spent years strategizing around the resistance to Bashar al-Assad. And one of the 16 or 17 points he'd made was around the depth of inclusiveness, which I thought was really fascinating. And he was saying this movement at some point needs to make space for those that had been sympathizers and are no longer sympathizers. I think that we can't just include everybody. Inclusion needs to be filtered towards the right direction. People need to pre-qualify for inclusion. Everyone deserves human rights. Everyone does. It's universal. That's the point of it, right? But this is a political and social direction we're going in. We need to make sure everyone's on the same page for that. Personally, I found it deplorable that the MacKay were invited to speak at Parliament 2 weeks ago, and I wrote about it on Twitter. Not because they don't have a right to speak, but because they are taking disproportionate space from legitimate voices that are inside Iran and outside Iran that may reflect the direction we want to go in more and better than them. there will be a time, if we want a free and democratic Iran, democracy includes the voices we don't like. But let's get our ship going in the right direction first and layer in that inclusion when the time is right. And that's my opinion.
Thank you, Soushiant, for your answer. Actually, this is very much related to the next question that we have here. I think as an activist, we all, from a few weeks ago, we all gathered and we tried to analyze and improvise about what's next for Iran and how we can help from here regarding the fact that there is not really, there is an absence of representative and effective political institutions. So technically, democracy usually needs tools, and we are lacking that inside Iran as much as outside of Iran. So this question, I would like to ask it from Ava, if that's okay. So the question is, in the absence of representatives and effective political institutions, how can we facilitate empowerment of Iranians to envision possibilities for a successful democratic future in Iran? How is that possible?
That's a really important and large question that we can, do a lot of research on and have a lot of discussions on and come to conclusion. But like I said, I'm a believer in the idea of bottom-top democracy, and that can start with, right now it's really dangerous to get to the streets, right? You might get killed. But how do we continue this resistance without giving our lives for it? Our slogan is woman, life, freedom, and life means we don't want to get killed. We don't want to get our youth killed. And the way we can organize that is we can have within each neighborhood, have these councils, have this meeting where people can get together and have discussions that practice democracy. Everything that we talked about, the coalition, how do we agree to disagree, how do we make space for each other, can happen in neighborhoods. We can start practicing democracy, practicing conversation, practicing pluralism right then and there.
I think then the idea is to do it in the neighborhoods. How can we help them out? Because I believe there are 6 to 8 million of us living outside of the country, and most of us are living in a democratic society, right? How can we transfer this knowledge so that they can apply in those neighborhoods? Are we supposed to, again, the idea of going from bottom to top or top to the bottom, are we supposed to have an umbrella organization or party or any kind of institution? Is it time for us to start that, to initiate that? If so, how we can do that outside the country or inside the country, how they can be correlated and help each other?
Right, and nowadays with the help of, again, we have internet blockage. If we didn't have internet blockage, we would be able to create that bridge with our people, because right now media isn't exactly creating that space. A lot of Iranian media abroad potentially are capable of creating a space like that, but they're not doing it because they're being funded by all these different groups that have followed their own agenda. And that's why they talked about the idea of coalition, right? We can start with that and have this conversation. There is no easy, straightforward, direct answer to this very important question that you're asking. But what I'm trying to say that it's not impossible. And you know how Dr. Danesh was also talking about looking at neighboring countries and see what we have achieved. Kurdish region in Syria has been practicing a bottom-top democracy for a decade, and they have been learning a lot in the process, right? There is so much we can learn from them, from their experience. So all we need is how do we connect the voices of diaspora with the voices within Iran and then have this exchange of information? We can do it through social media if our people within Iran can find access to internet.
Thank you very much. Anyone else from panelists would like to?
I'm just going to quickly say that there is a platform by an organization called Nahad Mardomi, and they have a new subsection of that organization called SOS Iran, and they provide a platform for Iranians within the country to come and engage on certain subjects or certain projects, and how they keep these people safe is by giving them an identity number so that they come onto this platform, and instead of having their name, they're given a number, and they work with other people both from inside and outside Iran, and you just see their number. You don't even know who you're interacting with, but you're working together on certain projects. I've just come to learn. I have to learn more about them, but if anybody takes the time to go onto their website, The New Iran, it's called in English, and it's SOS Iran. That's one way.
That's a great way, actually. That's a great way to start. And now we want to take questions from audience. Anyone here? Okay. Sorry, can I see the hands up? Okay. Starting from Fred.
Hello, everyone, and great discussion. Myself, as a person who has been in Canada for past 50 years, I think I've been here 7 years before revolution, and I have observed how Iranian regime has influenced in Canada. So don't take this sophisticated lobbies in Canada lightly. They are now listening to us. They know what we are going to do, and they are going to, and they have sources. They have money, they have support. They have infiltrated in every political party in Canada. They have lobbyists from every sector. So don't underestimate them. And also, one example is, before revolution, even the number of Iranians in Canada was much less, much less. During the revolution, or even year before revolution, you could see the media talking about Iran, talking about revolution, because there was no lobbyists to tell them this is not the way. Right now, the one reason I think which the media doesn't pay at much attention because of those lobbyists. Those lobbyists don't take them. They go and talk to media, different way. Anyway, so these are very dangerous, and we have to do something about that. Thank you.
Thank you. That was more of a comment. Thank you
I'll
very
just
much.
quickly speak to that.
Yeah, okay, sure.
You're absolutely right. There are Iran lobby groups, and as you said, they're not apparent. They don't come out saying, we represent the regime, but they're very sophisticated in how they are regime apologists in their articles, whether it's people like Azadeh Moaveni or Farnaz Fasihi. Then there's groups like NIAC in the United States that had huge influence inside the country. They had the ear of the Obama administration at the time. There are still some members that have the Biden administration's ear. And as you said, they're not apparent. Here in Canada, there was an organization called the ICC, the Iranian Canadian Congress, which at the beginning was a great group of Iranian diaspora, and they got hijacked by certain regime apologists as well. So we do have to be careful, and our Canadian academics and media also have to be made aware so that they know who are the legitimate voices of the Iranian people.
Thank you very much, Nazanin, and we're taking the next question.
In the middle over there with a question.
So just be cognizant of the timer up there. Go ahead.
There's someone in the middle.
Two questions at once. This fellow has been
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for all the panel members. A lot has been said, and a lot has to be said. By the way, I would like to add a point to the vision for the Iranian, future of Iran, as Nazanin was quoting, and the population of the Iranian expatriates around the world has been increasing during the past 40 years. It's around 8 million, and the best and the most valuable souvenir that we can send home is what we have learned in a civil society here, and that we can actually relay to our, Iranians home, virtually or, personally, and this is very valuable. The Canadian, the opposition parties here in the parliament, they get paid for their opposition, to correct the government, to oppose some of the, bills in the parliament. At the same time, in Iran, the opposition is jailed and being tortured. So one valuable souvenir that we can send home, and this is actually the experience we have earned during our stay in the Western countries in a civil society, and that's what we can do, number one. And
so sorry, we just want to get through a lot of questions, and we're over time. Is there a question regarding?
Okay, that was a point. That was a point.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going over there.
Oh, Melody, there's someone in the middle who also wants to ask a question. There's a fellow in the middle wearing black who's eager to ask a question.
Over here?
Yeah, over there in the middle.
Oh.
Just be cognizant, because we want to get through a lot of, this is supposed to be a discussion.
Oh, right over there, who's eager to ask a question.
I have two quick questions, and I promise to hit the timer. One of them is the history has told us that we have extremely, with dictators, mostly they're overthrown by violence. Has there been any paramilitary or underground groups that have tried to take out the leadership of Iran through violence? And my second question, very quickly, is art is so important, as the doctor mentioned. Are there any Iranian or non-Iranian filmmakers trying to make feature films right now to try, because they're so powerful? We have a film called The Swimmers right now that is just taking the world by storm and really making Syria, putting it in the world's view. Is there anything like that going on that we can make a change through fictitious feature films?
Can I address the first question? So this isn't my opinion. This is research from Harvard Kennedy School. There's a TEDx that a fellow by the name of Erica Chenoweth, American political scientist, put this presentation together comparing violent and non-violent attempts to overthrow dictatorships. And her assessment is that non-violent attempts to overthrow dictatorships are 2 times more successful than violent ones since the 1920s. And this graph, which I'll show you afterwards, if you guys can see, there's a downward decline of all the violent attempts, meaning unsuccessful in most parts, whereas the non-violent attempts have mostly done their job or come closer to it than otherwise. So I think that, we open up a whole host of other problems if this thing turns violent. Transitional justice becomes extremely difficult. Reining back, nonviolence at some point becomes extremely difficult. So I'll maybe go into it after and offline, but statistically it's not true.
I was also going to build on the same thing. There are a lot of artworks being done, but also the same thing. Like, we're dealing with a government who has failed ideologically, who has failed in terms of economy, socially, in so many levels. The only power they have is military power. They have had a lot of influence in Iraq, Syria, Yemen. They have been sending IRGC and their votes everywhere. So you don't deal with a government like that with any sort of violence. The power of people so far is how they have managed to stay peaceful despite the violence they have been dealing with on a daily basis. That's where the power of our people is.
There's an Iranian diaspora film festival. There's a lot of wonderful Iranian filmmakers. I don't know if they're doing something specifically since the revolution, but I've had a couple documentary filmmakers approach and saying they want to do something, and they're taking the step. So maybe we'll see something soon.
We've got one last question.
Really quickly, I can talk on the filmmakers. So in the past few months, I've actually talked to Iranian female directors, and in the first quarter of next year, we plan on putting an event together to feature their work. I can't mention some of them, but some I can. Aside from Tahirih Ghassemieh, the Persian Swan, she has a movement right now with her dance called Dance for Iran. It was featured in LA Times last week. You can follow her on social media, and you can see her movement right now. Just the other day, there was a dancer in Iran that was arrested for his protest dance, and Tahirih has brought attention to it. So Persian Swan will be released in early, I want to say January 2023, a short film. That in itself was an inspiration for the documentary for the Iran National Ballet. Another woman that we know, or that I've met a few weeks ago, I don't know if you know Mary Opek. She was very famous during the era of the ballet company. There's a very famous clip with her. She's actually now a director, producer. She did a short film called The Cat, which interestingly, she did it before this whole movement. And it's an animated short that you can see online, and it depicts this idea or this vision of what it was like to be going through a revolution. So for those that may have questions about what that experience was like, she did a very fantastic job doing that in her short animated film called The Cat. There are a few others, which if you follow me on Instagram or on Twitter, I'll be announcing early in January 2023 of getting all these female directors together to showcase their work. So,
thank you, Elle. So we have to clear the room by 9 o'clock. Please submit your questions and comments online. The panelists will be kind enough, I'm assigning you guys to answer them, if you can. There is someone is coming to close it.
Is there one more question? Yes, Mashid Hadi, our organizer, is going to come to give her closing remarks.
Thank you. Come on.
Sorry that we are really rushing to close this because we started late. So I'm super sorry. I know that everyone has a lot of questions from our amazing panelists here. I just want to quickly say thank you to our panelists that they were super generous to accept my invitation here. I want to thank, sure. I want to quickly thank Dr. Tamir, Dr. Al Sheba, and our co-sponsor Amina, and co-director of this festival. Where are you, Arman? Thanks, Nikta, and I'm thanking everyone because I value everyone's energy and help. Thank you, Katanajan. Thank you, Melody, Ali, all the amazing volunteers, Mariam, Mahdiar, Mariam, Saba, and everyone. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, the audience.
You've been a most pleasant audience. Thank you for being here. This night could not have come together if it weren't for Mashid's determination, perseverance. She had a vision. She saw through it in the face of obstacles, multiple obstacles. Mashid, thank you so much. Good night.
خدا نور است خدا محساس خدا سلطان قلب نیکاست خدا تو کوچه ها امروز شهامت در وجود ماست خدا تو ماج خدا صالح خدا امروز دوتا باله که باید برکشید با اون وگرنه معصیت داره خدا زلفای در باده خدا ایران آباده خداوند گوهر عشقیست که تا مرگ پای ستاره خدا از ما خدا با ماست خدا امید برا فرداست خدا اسمش عوض میشه یه روز عرفان یه روز اسراست یه روزم تو خیابوناست و با امید می جنگه یه روز شال روی چوبه یه روز قیچی برا موهاست خدا ندامونه. خدا یلدا، خدا پویاست، خدا تو روز نامیدی کنار برکه یک دورنا.
خیلی دوست دارم حالا که دارم میرم